this economy.
And that brings us nicely to Sarah. You alone up here can talk about the actual real world experience in a communication sense, actually, for a president fully in the social
Good afternoon. I'm Paul Almeida, Dean of Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. It is our privilege to host the annual Professional Speechwriters Association World Conference again this year. Welcome back. Here at Georgetown McDonough, we are firm believers that learning never ends. Whether you're attending a conference like this one, seeking an advanced degree, or working with our executive education team to develop a customized curriculum for your organization, there's always an opportunity to understand even more, to learn, and to explore. By nature, universities are creators and conveners of knowledge. At Georgetown McDonough, the work of our faculty and the experiences of our students are enhanced by our location in the global capital city of Washington, D.C., where we have access to national and global leaders in business, policy, government, and much more. Where else would you expect to find a session named All the President Spends? Thank you for being with us here today, and thank you to David Murray and the entire PSA team for organizing such a wonderful conference. It is now my distinct pleasure to invite Robert Schlesinger, author of White House Ghosts and moderator of our next session, to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Dean Almeida. Thank you to David and his team, as the Dean said, for organizing this. Thanks to Georgetown for hosting it. We have a really terrific panel, and I will briefly introduce them, and we'll get right to their thoughts, because it's much more, their thoughts are much more interesting than mine. Going from your left to right, chronologically, not in any indication of left to right in a political spectrum, we have Aram Bakshian, who actually was a hat-trick presidential speechwriter, having served Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, if I recall correctly. We have Bob Ratcliffe, who was a speechwriter for President Jimmy Carter and is now a candidate for Congress in Florida. We have Clark Judge, who was a speechwriter for President Reagan. Mary Kate Carey, who was a speechwriter for George H.W. Bush. Jeff Schessel, who was a speechwriter for President Clinton, and Sarah Perry, who was a speechwriter for President Obama, and I think we might be joined in progress by a speechwriter from the George W. Bush team as well. As is inevitable in Washington these days, we will get to the proverbial man of the moment and our thoughts about him eventually, because all conversations turn back to him these days. But I want to talk about the moment first, which is the age of social media and what it's like for a president and those assisting him to communicate in the age of social media. And I want to start with Aram and go chronologically down the line. And in the case of Aram and the earlier presidents, ask how would your boss have handled social media? And then as we get down to the person who actually can answer that question with real experience, I also would like the panel to talk about, is it a good thing for presidents to be able to engage on social media and really engage the public in that very sort of direct way?
Yeah, it's a very good thing. It's a good thing for presidents to know how to drive, but some of them are more reckless than others, probably. I think politics is a lagging indicator, because by the time they're in public office, very often they've already formed, and they're learning after other people have learned these things. Nixon, the first president I worked for, I think would have needed physical help. He was a total klutz when it came to pushing buttons and that sort of thing. But he would have figured out the effectiveness of using social media, and would have done it very cautiously and judiciously. Jerry Ford probably would be just very meat and potatoes when there was a legislative issue or something, but he wouldn't be zinging people. And Ronald Reagan, that will be got into more later, but Reagan was a communications natural, and early in life was in at the very beginning of several communication epochs. Radio as a factor for the first time, television afterwards, and of course Hollywood, as it then was, a unifying social factor. I think they'd all learn how to do it and know what they were doing with varied effectiveness in terms of their style.
Bob, Carter was sort of skeptical of communications as artifice, and not wanting to seem like he was using too much rhetoric or rhetorical trickery. What do you think he would have made of social media?
Well, I think he was remember he was an insurgent candidate, and he gained the office of the presidency by basically going out into the grassroots and winning in Iowa and winning in all these other places that he wasn't supposed to win. So I think he would have embraced that part of it as a useful tool. Now, would he have been good at it? I don't know. He wasn't very good at speeches. He didn't like to give speeches, and he especially didn't like speechwriters. So, because we were part of his problem, which was he wanted people to understand what his policies were and all the rational reasons that they were good for them, and he just didn't want to have to go out and explain that. So it was a challenge. But he would have been okay at social media. Now, social media back then really was cassettes. And we would, people would trade cassette tapes of speeches, and whenever we would feel depressed in the speechwriting staff, we'd pull out a tape of Gerald Ford's speech to the North Carolina future homemakers, in which he had this great line that said that, you can be proud that you're a homemaker, and a Tar Heel homemaker at that. And we'd all roar with laughter and just have a great old time. We'd feel much better.
Clark, how would the great communicator have handled the age of social media?
Well, in the same way he handled all media. And by the way, you missed one form of media that he was on the ground floor of, which was sound films.
Yeah.
He was one of the he enters the movie industry just shortly after it goes to sound. So he was very good at adapting to each form as it came along. Key for Reagan's communication was his own intense personal discipline. He learned things. He made it a point to learn things. He made it a point to understand the dynamics of a medium, and then to adjust the way he delivered to it. Here's a thought. When in 1964, I think it was, the average soundbite on television was about a minute and a half. By the time you get to 1988, according to the New Republic during the 88 campaign, it was 8 seconds. What is 8 seconds? It's a tweet. A lot of what we did, one of the things we made a point, my colleagues and I, of mastering was how to get media to quote us. That's why sound bites became so important. We had 3 little portals, really 4 or 5. The evening news shows. CNN was just coming on, didn't have much audience at the very end of our administration. New York Times, which was not exactly friendly. Washington Post, which was looking for its next Woodward and Bernstein moment. Not great if you're the guy sitting in, people sitting in the White House, and a few others. But we had, and their quotes would be about as long. We made a point, and the president made a point, he basically taught us, how to capture the media on the sentence you wanted. I think he would have done very well with Twitter.
Now, MK, George H.W. Bush very much said, my predecessor was the great communicator, I'm not that guy.
Correct.
He didn't want to be that guy. How would he have handled this age that we live in?
Well, as Clark said, when we came into office after you guys were leaving, CNN had just started. There were huge word processors with floppy disks that were, about this big. And so he would make a lot of jokes about the F7 button. And if somebody crossed him, he'd say, F7 that guy. And, so he would be the first to admit that he was not the most tech savvy.
He was F7?
Yes, he was. But in general, I think he, like President Carter, did not like giving speeches, like you're saying. He realized he was not the great communicator. And he was very good in small groups, one-on-one. He would much rather do a press conference with questions than give a speech. And I think that side of social media, if it had existed then, would have played to his strengths. He's got a very good sense of humor, and I think that would have brought it to the fore. So many people now, as I go around the country talking about him, say, why did we not know how funny he was? And I think it would have helped him probably get reelected. The other thing he faced was all 4 years of a Democratic Congress, and was able to get through quite a bit of big bipartisan legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, things like that. And I think having social media would have shown some of the things he was doing behind the scenes to rally those votes and to unify the coalition that he was building. And I think that would have helped him, and people would have seen that, and it would have been to his great credit, I think.
His first lady, I think, would have been very good, too.
Oh, yeah. She'd be great. She'd be great.
Now, Jeff, Clinton was actually technically the first president of the internet age. And I remember, I think it was a story that you told me where you were working on a speech, and he said, no, this is a speech. I just want to talk to people. How would he have handled it?
I think he would have had trouble with a 140-character limit. It's interesting to watch him on Twitter now. I don't know how many of you follow President Clinton on Twitter, but he's not making a lot of news on Twitter. I think that's by design. He's been pretty restrained in his use of Twitter, and he's trying to, I think, advance a couple of ideas right now. Of course, he's not President of the United States, so he doesn't have that need to push out arguments on a whole range of different things at once. But I think that, for me, what it points up is that he was president during a time of intense transition. I mean, maybe that is always going to be true now, given the pace of change. He was the first president of the information age. We wrote many, many speeches about the information age and the World Wide Web and what an amazing thing it is and was. At the same time, I think he was a little uncertain about this new technology himself. It's actually very hard to put yourself back in mindset of the late 1990s because it's sort of similar, and yet it's pretty dramatically different in terms of what could be taken for granted. People were afraid to buy stuff online because they didn't feel that their credit card information was safe. I don't know why anybody would ever think that today.
What possibly could go wrong?
It was felt that the president needed to demonstrate that this, in fact, is safe. And so we kind of set him up after a lot of careful vetting of websites and so forth to buy some Christmas gifts online and show that it could be done. So we got him a laptop from somewhere else in the West Wing. He didn't have one of his own. And we felt, looking at it, that A, it was sort of product placement for Dell because it had the Dell logo on the back, and B, it just didn't feel very presidential. So one of the junior people in the speechwriting operation printed up on a color laser printer the presidential seal. We cut that out and we stuck it to the back of the laptop. And the president went on the laptop, and somebody brought up the website that would allow him to buy a smoked ham or something like that for Christmas. And he's looking at it online, and he starts to touch so either he was totally out of touch with what technology could do, or he was way ahead of his time in anticipating. You know, you have to tell the President of the United States in the Oval Office, it sort of doesn't work like that. Don't touch it anymore. And so I think that he was in transition, the technology was in transition, and in terms of its utility to us, the jury was still very much out. We felt very much at the mercy, as I think all presidents do now, at the mercy of the 24-hour, 24/7 news cycle. But the technological tools that we had, I don't think we felt enabled us to do anything affirmative. We were dealing with what was coming at us, but we didn't have Twitter, we didn't have Facebook. Video technology online was not such that you could put your speeches out there and have that actually be a useful thing to do. So I think we were uncertain about what we could do with it other than tout it as terrific for the U.S. economy.
And that brings us nicely to Sarah. You alone up here can talk about the actual real world life experience of having to deal with this in a communication sense, actually, for a president fully in the social media age. Can you give us a sense of what that was like?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is, although the internet had obviously been around by the time President Obama came into office, his 8 years was really an evolution of social media, right? So Twitter and Facebook and all these other platforms kind of grew with his presidency. And so I came on, during the second term, and so they already had a pretty robust digital strategy office that was integrated with the communications team and with the speechwriters. But I think what it actually meant for us was that in addition to sort of having to deal with this fragmented media landscape where Twitter could slice and dice a speech and then filter it through whatever news channel it wanted, and then the message intended wasn't always the message received, it also presented enormous opportunities for us. And so, President Obama might, or a speech might not become the only avenue through which to deliver a message. And so maybe we would start with a speech about the importance of higher education, but that would just be the opening salvo of the message. And then from there, we might turn it into an Instagram picture of the president and the first lady in their college sweatshirts, and then reminding kids to apply for college and fill out their FAFSA. And then from that, it might turn into a Facebook post, which would then get shared and tweeted out, and then it turns into a hashtag, and so now the hashtag spreads it even further. And so it was actually a way to deliver policy initiatives and direct them towards audiences that maybe aren't watching his speech that's being shown on C-SPAN, that the audiences that actually needed to get the message. I remember a couple years ago, the president, I don't know how this happened, but I guess the communications office convinced the president to do some interviews with YouTube stars. Now, I don't even really understand what that means, but basically it seems as though there are young people on YouTube who have millions of followers, and millennials or teenagers or someone watches them, and I don't know. The Office of Speechwriting was like, "What is happening? What is this?" But so he said, actually, I've got some important messages to deliver to these young people. Let me go and do these interviews with these YouTube stars. And as you can imagine, the traditional media was not happy at all about these, 22-year-old, this young woman who promoted makeup styles or something, getting this interview with the president. But it was actually a really great way for him to reach young people, and these young people, to their credit, asked him really good questions. One of these young women asked the president very boldly about why female sanitary products are taxed, and the president gave a really thoughtful answer, and then that turned into a policy push. And so I think that President Obama was actually really sort of strategic in his use of social media. And, oftentimes someone like me in the speechwriting office didn't always know necessarily the latest technology. And I think maybe having 2 teenage daughters helped President Obama sort of at least stay on the curve, if not ahead of it. But he knew things. And so he would say, should we do this as a Facebook Live, event where people can actually watch me talk about healthcare? Should we do a Snap story, which I still don't know what that is, but it's some way of reaching out people. And so I think he was thoughtful about how to do it, and I think he also saw Twitter in contrast to where we are now, I think he saw it as a way of really reaching a lot of people and still being the voice of the president. And so while it may have been informal compared to a speech, and it may have been obviously truncated, he very much put a lot of thought into when it was appropriate to tweet, what he might tweet, and sort of who he was trying to reach and why. And oftentimes they were sort of bigger events or things he wanted to comment on very quickly that he felt warranted that. So I think overall he was a really strategic person when it came to social media.
Yeah, if I could say something to follow up on that, and complimentary of President Obama, not something you'll hear me do very much, but President Obama faced two communications revolutions, both of which he handled very well. The first was cable. And you think of the primaries in 2008. Every night, you may remember it was Clinton one week, Obama the next, Clinton the next week. It was back and forth. It's custom for the winner to wait for the loser to concede. And they each were getting about 10 minutes. Mrs. Clinton would come out, whether she was first or second, and she would do what politicians had been doing forever. She would recognize everybody in the audience by name, everybody who had helped her. By the time her 10 minutes was up, she was just getting to her message. President Obama did exactly, at that time candidate, Senator Obama, did exactly the opposite. He would come out and he went right into his message. So by the time his 10 minutes was up, he had reached the whole nation, or at least the whole party, with why they should vote for him. That was a clear understanding of the new media environment that no other candidate in that campaign displayed. Now you now move to 2008 and the re-election. I'm sorry, 2012. Yes, 12. The 12 and the re-election. Dates aren't my thing. 2012 and the re-election. The Obama campaign very much did what you were describing, which I want to contrast to President Trump. They very shrewdly used it as a way of segmenting voters and reaching the voters in the segment, whether it was a woman who was best known for taking baths with Fruit Loops, or which was one of the media stars, or somebody else. That sounds funny, and you didn't laugh. But
you've got to improve your tweeting skills.
Yes, yeah, but it's serious. That was a way of segmenting voters and reaching voters through that segmentation. But the difference between that and what we've seen over this campaign, though there's been some of that, a fair amount of that in this campaign, is that the Trump strategy for tweets and other social media that he personally controlled was not really aimed at the segmented voter. It was aimed at the media. And it was his way, and continues to be his way, of capturing the television and newspaper news cycles. It used to be that each day began with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and the morning shows would follow from them. They'd basically have the papers out and they'd be reporting. And the first time the White House would really reliably be able to get into the conversation would be at the noontime news briefing. That might get them on the evening news. Think of it, watch Morning Joe, Today, any of those. I guess those are two NBCs, which these days a Republican isn't supposed to acknowledge. But that's another joke. I want to hear more of that. But think of it. You get the New York Times and the Washington Post still have their story. They're all primed up. The shows are all primed up to focus on that. And along comes the tweet, and it controls the show. So it's a different strategy. There's still the Obama strategy of slicing. But the power of this strategy is that it's taken social media and used it to drive all media.
One other thing about that. It also is a way of taking all of the air out of the room. no, even when Trump does a tweet that may turn off some people, annoy some people, puzzle some people, he has dominated that day to the exclusion of most of his opposition, or they're just reacting to what he said. Mm-hmm. He's dictated what they're going to react to. In addition, he tweets so often that people fairly rapidly forget the last thing they were annoyed at. And
there's almost again.
Well, they get annoyed again, but then it just goes. I mean, there's a sort of gradual numbness that sets in.
Does that hurt the effectiveness of presidential communication, though, where if people are becoming benumbed to presidential pronouncements, does that cheapen the presidential word?
It works.
Or Bob and then Jeff.
Yeah, no, it works. I mean, how can you argue with success? So he dominates the conversation with these ridiculous tweets, and they keep coming, and every day there's another one. And he's such a moving target that, as a Democrat, I don't know what to talk about him when I'm discussing issues. So I go after Paul Ryan.
I guess I would draw a distinction between dominating the news, which he is definitely doing, and leading the discussion. He's dominating the national discussion without actually leading it. And what I mean by that is that he has shown again and again, and he's probably done it while we're sitting up here, that he fires off a tweet or makes some stray statement, and nobody can talk about anything else for the next 24 hours. He throws everyone, as you just said, he throws everyone off their stride. But what he is not doing is what every president represented on this panel has done, which is to try in a sustained and disciplined way to lead the nation toward a particular outcome. And how do they do it? They do it by all sorts of means, but speeches and public statements are a huge part of that. It won't surprise you that we're all going to say that, but I think we all believe that very deeply. That if you're going to try to get anything done in this country, whether you're going to try to get something through Congress, whether you're going to try to turn public opinion in your favor on a particular issue, whether you're going to try to get your allies to subscribe to a particular policy change that you're trying to lead, you've got to be out there consistently, you've got to be speaking with clarity, and you've got to lead a discussion. It is difficult to do because you're not the only one who gets to occupy the stage, and there's more and more noise out there now than there has ever been before. But right now the noise is coming from the Oval Office. And so I think it is effective in the sense that everyone pays attention to it, although I'm not sure that's going to work forever. But it is not effective in actually getting anything done. There's not anything that President Trump has done during his time in office that is the result of the careful effort at the bully pulpit. He's signed executive orders, as all previous presidents have done. He's done stuff by fiat. But he has not led the nation to do anything that it was not going to do already. And that is a huge failure, I think, of rhetorical leadership and presidential leadership.
I also think that
It's my speech.
that all of the presidents that we worked for, they all saw their role not only to sort of advance an agenda or drive us toward an outcome, but to, at moments, unify a country that was divided and be the president of all people who even didn't vote for them. And, Clark, I don't have a ton of nice things to say about your boss either, but he did that beautifully, right? And I think where Trump is, in addition to everything else that's horrific that's happening and the way that he sort of communicates in terms of not leading the news, he's also not creating any kind of cohesive narrative that all of us can kind of follow, right? So even presidents that we might politically disagree with would sort of tell a story of America that they believed in and that would sort of, under which we could all cohere in some way. And that provides credibility as a leader. And he doesn't have that, in addition to other things that he has done to erode his own credibility or never develop any. And I think that becomes a problem at moments when a country really does need to come together, and when people do need to sort of seek a leader. There's sort of a vacuum. There's an absence there, and he's very much the president of just a few people. And the bully pulpit and all of the avenues of social media that we have now are an opportunity for the president to use to actually offer that narrative, even if it's one that that everyone doesn't necessarily agree with. And he's not really doing that. It's very sort of fragmented.
There's an element here. Why is he different the way he is different? Everyone for years has been saying, what we really need are citizen presidents who aren't politicians. Well, we got one. And one of the differences between someone who's never been in public life before and then suddenly at a high level runs for office is people who've been in public life for a long time do have a structured set of values, aims, policies. It evolves over time, but that's what they've been spending their lifetimes working about and thinking about. This is the first president that doesn't fit into that mold in this century. And we shouldn't be too surprised. However, the evidence would seem to indicate that whether you're on the left or on the right, the path that he used is increasingly a tempting path for non-politicians to go for the big one. And we have an audience that has been dumbed down in many senses culturally and attention span and everything else, so that celebrityhood has become a key in a way it couldn't have been in past generations.
I'm not sure I'd agree with what's been said. First of all, one of the goals of the tweeting is to keep others from dominating the news cycle. Yeah. And in an environment that is as hostile as this one has been, no honeymoon, starting off the night of the election, the opponent didn't even come out and concede until the next day. And that reflected that she may have been incapacitated, but that reflected a general view within that party. This is a kind of environment that's extremely challenging. At the same time, he has had a message. I disagree with that. It may not be your message, but the Make America Great Again slogan encompassed within it a message of renewal, reform, renewal. It also encompassed a message of alarm at the current state of affairs, both of which he has been effectively communicating as he went along. The fact that we're still in the process of a long legislative struggle, both on health care reform, tax reform, and other areas, indicates how divided both his own party is and the country is. We say the Republicans are controlling Congress. Not in a meaningful way. Both parties have within them, in the Senate, independents who are caucusing with their party. Obviously, Senator Sanders, I think Senator King, are both examples on the Democratic side. On the Republican side, Senator Murkowski was not elected on the Republican ticket, remember. She was a write-in candidate. And Senator McCain is clearly views himself, perhaps for personal reasons, perhaps for reasons of principle, independent of his own party now. And both parties are facing that. The Democratic independents stick pretty loyally to the Democratic Party. The Republican ones obviously are more problematic. But that is the character of the country. I wouldn't write off or even make a judgment on the legislative program just yet. We know that the Republicans are continuing working on health care. They may be working with some Democrats too. We know the same is true in tax reform. We've got a very challenging environment in Washington, much more closely divided than people think. The president sometimes has been brilliant at mobilizing, and other times has stumbled. The one thing I would say about the Twitter issue, to get back to that, is that it's emblematic of the new age, which is fairly unfiltered. I've been dealing in my business, which is a communications business, with the new age for a decade and a half now. And for all that time, we've been telling people that there is an authenticity is a big issue. But what does authenticity bring with it? You don't have remarks as filtered as they once were. It's true in business, and it's true in government and politics. Sometimes he really missteps. Other times, he hits home runs. But that's the nature of the new age. If you're going to use the new social media, if it's scrubbed to a shine, people will see through it and you won't be effective. You've got to find a way to be authentic, immediate, and not blow yourself up.
I think it's fair to note that Mrs. Clinton's hesitancy to concede on election night could very well have been reflective of more simpler explanations like wanting to make sure all the results were in. I do want to, however, come back to the question at hand. To what extent is this, we've seen the diminution of the soundbite. We have seen the rapidity of communications and the noise we've talked about. Jeff, you've written about the notion that the president has abandoned the bully pulpit even if he hasn't shut up. Are presidential speeches and speechwriting as we move forward into the information age, are you all going to be obsolete?
Boy, I sure hope not.
We're an example of artificial intelligence.
I can't think of anything more unrewarding than being one of Donald Trump's speechwriters. I mean, it just all the things you learn about what it takes to write a good speech and how you the process of writing and vetting and getting up and giving a speech is just completely gone out the window. And do I think there's a future for it? Of course. I can't. I have to believe that people want more than just angry torrents. They do want some coherence, and they want to be inspired. They want to think that the future is going to be better for them. I'm running in a district that Trump won with 66% of the vote, so I'm an optimist. But I grew up among people like that, and I was an enlisted man in the Navy. I know the kind of challenges that people like that face, and I'm going door to door, and I'm also giving speeches, and I put them up on the internet, and I've gotten good responses, and I think that this is not normal.
MK, you're an optimist. Is this normal?
I am an optimist. Every Friday, I have to be on Canadian TV explaining to the Canadians what happened in Washington this week. and it's a joy.
It's a bit like South Park, right?
So as a result of that assignment, I actually watch a lot of Donald Trump's speeches. I've gotten to know some of his speechwriters. So I would respectfully disagree with Bob. They are actually very hardworking, mid-career professionals. They're not 22-year-olds. Many of them have come from the leadership offices on Capitol Hill or from governor's offices. And if you listen to, for example, his speech to the UN, he had a great defense of democratic capitalism in it. He said the problem with Venezuela is not that socialism was implemented incorrectly, but that it was implemented 100% correctly, and that's why there's such a disaster in Venezuela. However, in that same speech, the president then, I believe, I don't think the speechwriters did this, put in the reference to Rocket Man, and he rolled it out there, and the press went for the shiny object, just as he thought they would, and nobody covered the defense of democratic capitalism. His values summit speech last week, which was on I had to sit live and listen to it with the Canadians and then immediately comment on it, had a great discussion on religious liberty and why that's important in this country. So his speeches are actually advancing an agenda. They have a very coherent populist reform message that is, to Clark's point about making America great again rather than just standing with her. And I think that is why he continues to be so popular outside of the coast of this country. So there's more to it, I think, than the press is reporting.
I mean, it won't surprise you that we're doing a little, we're respectfully disagreeing with one another here, but I hope we're doing it respectfully.
It's a Washington thing.
Right.
Actually, respectful disagreement isn't so much a Washington.
Yeah, that's true.
We're lucky to be
It was a Washington.
It was, yeah.
I would rate the success of Donald Trump's speeches by your ability. This is a tuned-in group of people. Your ability to turn to the person next to you and tell that person what his position is on tax reform, except that we should have it. I would ask you to articulate to someone at home what his position is on health care, except that Obamacare is a disaster and that apparently we learned yesterday it no longer exists. He doesn't have a clearly articulated position on the issues that are supposedly at the center of his reform agenda. His ability to articulate those has not yet been established. His level of understanding of those issues has not been established in the open sort of press availabilities that he does. Everybody's seen that he changes position from one day to the other, that he makes misstatements of fact that are sometimes apparently purposeful, that are other times born of an ignorance of the basic facts or policy details, even coming out of his own White House. So I don't doubt that speechwriters are working hard, and I don't doubt that certain passages of certain speeches, including that one, articulate an idea. There is effort being made. But that effort is being consistently undercut by a president who is not able to string together a coherent or consistent thought within a given 20-minute block or from day to day. And again, I judge that not from my little bubble in Northwest Washington, D.C., but by the inability of anyone who really pays close attention to this to actually intuit what the president is arguing. There's a basic reformist impulse. Yes, he thinks the system, he thinks the establishment are failing. We understand that. He wants to make America great again. We understand the impulse toward some notion of greatness that he has yet to articulate. But we still don't know what he stands for. Never mind what the Republican Party, with all its diversity of opinion, stands for. What does this one man who's been elected to this office believe on any of the central issues of the day? That has yet to be established, and what we see in his speeches is this sort of weirdly split personality where the speeches that require something formal that is written and that is teleprompted feels a little like a hostage video, like he's delivering it under duress. He looks uncomfortable. He seems to want to get out of there. It's not that clear whether he believes what he's saying. He often then contradicts it the following day. When he gave in the middle of the crisis that he helped to create over Charlottesville, in the middle of that, when he sort of took back what he had previously said, he did it in an extraordinarily inert statement delivered from a teleprompter that just conveyed to the audience, this is not me talking, I am reading, and we will get through this together. The next day, he says what he thinks again, which is that he was right the first time. And so those are the two modes. There's sort of free associating Trump, and there is by the book, buttoned up, I don't really mean it Trump. And, it's clear where the real Trump is, but that Trump is not a consistent thinker. And so we're waiting for it, but we're not seeing it. And I think this is more than growing pains, and this is more than intra-party divisions, but it's a lack of clear thinking.
Aram, you wanted to jump in.
Well, Trump have a program. He also landed in a political situation where the parties were more antagonistic towards each other than ever before, and also more divided within themselves than ever before. Trump is as much a symptom as he is a problem, if you're talking about the stasis and the other problems that we're dealing with today. And in fact, he reflects a condition that existed before he got there. We've had policy wonk presidents. Jimmy Carter was probably the ultimate policy wonk, who didn't like giving speeches, but he thought people should know already and understand that. I think the senior Bush was the same way. He sort of thought, my job is to do the right sorts of things. I shouldn't have to explain that to people. Well, of course, you've got to make the sale first. Trump does deliver serious speeches from time to time on major issues. They are, if the audience can't remember them specifically, it's not so much because of what he did or didn't say in that speech. It's that he was simultaneously driving the headlines with these other things. It wasn't that his speech was deficient or the speechwriters hadn't done their job, or even that the speech of record didn't matter, because it will matter with the constituency. When he speaks to the UN, it matters what the message was to the constituent countries of the United Nations more than it does what the TV audience reacted to.
Yeah, I think to follow up on that, a lot of what you see Trump doing is a reflection also, not just of the divisions in the country, but also of his assessment of where the media is.
No.
The media is not interested in serious policy. He gives lots of serious policy speeches. If you had to pick between him and Clinton in terms of who got policy messages through to the public, not who wrote 10,000 pages of policy papers, but got serious policy messages through to the public, he won hands down. That's what drove his campaign. It wasn't that he was such a nice guy. We know that. But that's another thing you're supposed to laugh at. But, thank you. But he does have a sense of the frivolity or the way the media goes to things, and he'll give them that thing that they go to.
No.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to relitigate the 2016 campaign, but those are fighting words. Democrats, do you want to?
I'm sorry, I don't have much of a poker face. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me just touch on a couple of things. So if Trump's policy message got out, it was because, and there have now been studies to show this, the media was excessively interested in litigating and relitigating the faux scandal of Secretary Clinton's emails, and not in her very detailed policy platforms, and in the sort of Make America Great one-liners that he called policy, build a wall, ban Muslims, etc. And that was really salacious and interesting, and everybody jumped on it. But again, to Jeff's point, that wasn't really a coherent policy platform. And if Trump is a symptom of anything, it seems to me that he's a symptom of a sort of disintegrating Republican Party that has had an internal war basically between the donors and the base. And, the people who elected Donald Trump, who claimed he was going to cut taxes for the middle class, were not voting for Paul Ryan's agenda. And the people who the entire time were supporting this, and frankly, the Republicans in Congress who for 8 years were claiming that they were going to repeal Obamacare had 7 years to do it and couldn't come up with a policy, basically were the dog that caught the car. They didn't think they were going to end up in this position, and now they have to do something. And if Make America Great is anything other than sort of a slogan, at least from a policy perspective, based on his executive actions, based on the fights he's having legislatively, it just seems to be to erase the presidency of Barack Obama. And I just wonder if his base, who have, at least in the campaign, were willing to give him a chance and were willing to say, this guy's going to shake things up, let me just see what happens. I don't know if they're going to be maybe they will, as forgiving if erasing the Obama agenda actually makes their lives worse. So if you take away their health care and you just cut taxes on millionaires, are they going to be okay with that? I don't know. But it just seems like at some point there's got to be some kind of reckoning with what this is going to look like in people's lives. There's much more to unpack, but I'll just stop there.
Bob, very quick.
I think of this as the dawn of the age of post-globalism. For the last half century, we've been embarked on this great experiment of globalization. Let's lower tariff barriers, let's increase trade, let's farm out some of our economic activities to other countries. And I think the failure of that has been that we haven't spent enough time to the people who did not benefit from that. I'm running in a district that is 57% rural. And rural America has been in decline for decades now. No more agricultural employment. Small manufacturing went away 20, 30 years ago. Long distance commuting is about the only way for people to make a living if they live in a rural county in my part of Florida. And we have to begin grappling with that. And I think that, in a sense, Trump was good at diagnosing the problem and recognizing it, and we Democrats did not. But the solutions just are not coming from him. There aren't any solutions. It's just let's get angry all over again and get angrier and angrier, and we're doing great with just getting people angry. So we need to, and that's where I think of writing as a form of problem solving. You know, you get a problem, you have to write a speech. That's the problem. So what's the issue? You take the issue apart, put it back together in a coherent form. You come up with some solutions that make sense, and when you read through it, it's logical and rational and compelling.
I want to quickly take it back to the broader topic of speechwriting, and we have microphones in either aisle. If people want to start lining up, we'll open it up to questions from the audience in a moment. But as speechwriters, as professional speechwriters, in 140 words or less, what advice would you give Trump or his speechwriters? Why don't we start with Aram and work our way down?
Think. Trump is a man of instinct and impulse. He has great strengths in that direction. His instincts and his ability to spot the vulnerabilities of the opponents, it's always there, but sometimes you've got to think a step beyond that. So he should reflect more, use his skills to even better effect than he has so far.
Bob?
My advice is quit your job and before it's too late. And you'll have a nice little, 8-month entry on your resume, and that'll be good. And then you can get a good job in the private sector, like I did. And most of my career has been in corporate speechwriting. So, but there's nothing to be gained by staying on with that man.
Clark?
That's career advice, and I know careers. I've been doing this.
Clark, any speechwriting advice?
Well, Scott Adams, the cartoonist who does Dilbert, says he's the best brander we've ever seen. And so there's a lot to be said about his communications ability. He wouldn't be in the presidency having spent about 2/3 of what his opponent spent or less, and getting the kind of hits he got in the media we all know about that seemed to me much more serious than what happened to Mrs. Clinton, but maybe they just fought to a draw on that. But without having substantial communication skills and having got a message across. His presidency will rise or fall, in my judgment, on how he deals with Korea and how he deals, and whether he can come up with an economic strategy, including health care reform and tax reform, that gets us over 3% growth. If he can do that, he'll be reelected and he'll have a successful presidency. If he can't, he won't. So my advice to him, that's your, what do they say, focus on the donut, not on the hole? Well, that's your donut.
MK?
I completely agree with Clark on 3% growth would solve a lot of problems in this country. But my advice for the speechwriters would be more humor. I'm going to see President Bush Friday night, and every time I see him, he says, "Mary Kate, do you have any jokes for me?" And so I always ask around before I head down to see him, and everybody I've asked lately, I've said, "Hey, you got any jokes for me?" Nobody has any jokes right now. We need more humor in political rhetoric in our city right now, and I would vote get a ghostwriting joke writer on retainer at the White House.
Jeff, I know Bob stole yours, but what's your other piece of advice?
I don't think these are problems speechwriting can solve, that speechwriters can solve. I remember when at the end of the Clinton administration, when a few of us started this group, West Wing Writers, we sort of moved our little corner of the shop to the private sector. One of the first corporate clients that I had brought me in and said, "Look, our CEO is Bob Dole, and we want you to turn him into Bill Clinton." And I said, with all due respect, I didn't turn Bill Clinton into Bill Clinton. He elevated us by his ability, and he challenged us to help him raise his game. And speechwriters can do that. There's a lot, I think we all believe, that speechwriters can do. But I don't think any amount of creative or deft or thoughtful work by the speechwriters is going to solve this set of fundamental problems that at least some of us on this panel see in this presidency, even the purely rhetorical piece of this presidency. He's got to figure out actually what he believes. He's got to figure out exactly what he thinks he's going to do with his time in office. And you can write it any way you want to write it, but he's got to believe it, he's got to then own it, he's got to go out and articulate it, and he's got to do it consistently, as we've been saying. And that discipline has been, as far as I think any of us can see, it's been lacking in this presidency. As I said before, I think these are more than growing pains. I think they're basic deficiencies. I don't question his ability to get attention. I don't question his ability to grab the nation by its throat. And I don't question his ability, as he demonstrated in 2016, to articulate some very basic yearnings that a lot of good Americans are feeling, as well as a lot of bad Americans are feeling. And he gives voice to those as well. But he has not yet understood how to speak like a president. And I don't mean speak like my president or speak like yours or President Reagan or President Bush. But the solution is not to make him policy wonk and not to make him read from the teleprompter. It's to get him to articulate in a clear way what he actually thinks. And we don't yet know it. And I'm not sure we're going to find out.
Sarah?
It's too important not to repeat. I would tell speechwriters to quit, and it's because not only are you need to be able to sort of look your kids in the eye and talk to your grandchildren one day and tell them what you did during this time, and you're working for somebody who's corrupt and flawed in all of the ways, but he lies. And as a speechwriter, truth is actually really important. And I know we're now sort of in a space where people are kind of questioning whether Trump has changed rhetoric. Has he changed the way presidents communicate? And gosh, I hope not in that sense. And again, not every president does this and not every president has to, but we had an office of fact-checking, basically. I think you guys all probably did, right? I mean, your speeches went through really rigorous fact-checking. There was a truth. And when your principal is as mendacious as this one, it is incredibly hard to do your job well. And so in addition to all the other reasons I would tell them to quit, I would say that this is going to make your job impossible, and really there's so much other work out there. Do something else.
All right, let's go to questions.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. This is so good. I currently write for President Clinton, and so I'm really excited to see, Jeff, that you're here. All of you, thank you so much. My colleagues and I are still in mourning that we're not going to join your club of being White House speechwriters. But my question for you is, Bob, you mentioned that speechwriting is problem solving, or solving a puzzle. How, in the voice of a former president, when you're supposed to show restraint and respect for the person occupying the office, do you respond in this age of Trump? Do you have any advice for anyone who, for a former president speechwriter, for someone maybe in the public sector who has to respond to these issues and has to show restraint but also respond thoughtfully? Thank you.
Well, I think that first I'll just say what I said before, which this is not normal. This is, and it's not sustainable. As far as I look at the policy prescriptions for the problems we have today, and the impact on the rural people of North Florida that I care so much about, and it's going to make things far worse. Dismantling health care. I mean, the rural health care system is on its last legs right now. We have the Wall Street Journal did an article about maternal deserts. And that's most of rural America, where there are no OBGYNs within, 50, 100 miles of a lot of expectant mothers. So it's not good. Just keep trying to think logically and constructively. And I think my colleagues here have been very good about things like that. But this just isn't going to last. So.
I would just add very briefly, nice to meet you. Our first client coming out of the White House was President Clinton, and we worked with him for the first 4 years of his post-presidency and then occasionally afterwards. And so I was very much a part of that transition that he made to the post-presidency and understanding what the limits really were on his voice and his freedom of maneuver and how he could be most helpful to in advancing the ideas and the policies and the programs that had been such a part of his presidency. One of the things that really struck me at that time and still strikes me about Bill Clinton and his post-presidency, and I think this is true very much of the Bushes in their post-presidency and President Carter. President Reagan didn't get quite the post-presidency that the others have had because of the onset of Alzheimer's. The restraint they have shown, the respect they have shown for one another in the office. I think one of the most heartening stories in modern politics has been the friendship, the genuine friendship that Bill Clinton and both Bushes have developed. It's real. There's a real fondness there. And they were, President Bush would have been president another 4 years, the first President Bush, if it hadn't been for Bill Clinton. So he didn't have to be accepting of Bill Clinton in the years afterwards. And that's a very special thing. And I think with the restraint that we've seen from President Obama during these first months of his post-presidency is very much in keeping with that set of values. At the same time, I really do believe that we're in different territory now, and that what is jeopardized is not simply a program that you passed or a surplus that you developed in the federal budget, but something even more fundamental than that. And so I think that President Clinton, the presidents on the other side of the aisle, President Obama, they are going to be tested in the years forward as to how restrained they can be. Outside the context of a campaign, and I think President George W. Bush has very subtly and I think appropriately indicated his displeasure with both the campaign and the presidency that we have seen so far. I think he's been awfully restrained about it, and you can only imagine what he actually really thinks.
Does anyone else want to jump in and tackle that?
Just a quick, the most important speech writing that will be done, political speech writing that will be done between now and a year from November, will be the speeches being written for candidates on both sides who are running in the midterm elections. Because to the extent that the issues, whether I agree with your interpretation or whether I take mine, to the extent that those elections clarify things and the composition of the legislature shapes up in a more orderly way, that will determine, A, what will stop things you might not like about Clinton or about Trump, or accelerate real programs where he'll have to deliver. And if he delivers, he may deliver things some of us like, he may deliver some things some of us don't, but it won't just be rhetoric anymore. But the important speech writing is going to be done in the midterm elections around the country, not anything that's going to be written for the president or past presidents.
Hi, name's Dan. I'm a speechwriter from Canada. So
do you listen to Mary Kate every Friday?
Yes,
Hello.
Thank you for trying, by the way.
My one viewer.
Yes. So I want to take up the point that you made about truth at the end of the sort of panel discussion without sort of throwing stones at anybody in particular. We're starting to see a little bit of the same thing in Canada. You're also seeing it in Europe with the rise of the sort of the right on there, where the polarization of the body politic has got to a point where, it used to be that you'd have more or less common agreement on what the facts were and then different ideas about what the solutions to those problems were. Now the disagreement is sort of about what the facts are, and it's very hard from a rhetorical standpoint to try and build an argument when you're talking to half of the body politic about this issue and the other half is saying, well, that's not even the situation, that's not reality for us. So what advice do you have just in terms of for speechwriters about trying to overcome that barrier and talk to the country as a whole?
Well, I'm a historian by training. So one of the things you learn in history is that nothing ever happens for the first time. And I reject utterly this idea that we're more divided than we've ever been. I mean, have you ever heard of the Civil War? This is...
In my defense, we didn't have one of those.
I know. When I got engaged to my wife 12 years ago, I said, "Honey, let's honeymoon in Toronto." I really said that, and she said, "Are you nuts?" Of course we're divided. We've always been divided. We're going to keep being divided. What's going to make a difference is the level of civility we practice, and that's what I think is, in this case, has been very destructive.
If I could just jump in on that, I've been, you ought to take a read or a listen to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were high-minded and all, but they had they said a lot of nasty things about one another in a civil way, and they had lots of disagreements about basic facts, like whether one had endorsed his own party's platform or things like that. So some of this is to be expected in a period where the country is very divided. It basically hasn't made up its mind for a while on what direction it wants to go. And we've had very able men, all of us here represented very able men, who have debated on both sides of this. Country is still not quite sure where it wants to go, and I think we've got to keep at it to give him his due. President Trump is certainly keeping at it, so is Senator Schumer, so will whoever comes in against President Trump in the next time around. And at some point, the public will make up its mind. But right now, it's repeatedly sent very narrowly divided Senates, often narrowly divided houses, and sometimes a president who isn't with both the Senate and House in the same party. In other words, very balanced constitutional orders, and sent them back and said effectively, you guys have to figure out how to do this.
Isn't there an element, though, to which the fracturing of media and the multiplication of news sources and the rise of social media, which increasingly is where people get their news, some of it real news, some of it actually legitimately fake, made-up news. Does that make it harder, as our Canadian friend asked, for politicians of either party to be able to make an argument if it's harder to have a common set of facts?
If I could say, I think it's reversion to mean. I think the period of the major networks and a few national newspapers was an aberration.
I think it is obviously much more difficult, but I think there are opportunities. And I think about the times that President Obama, who was governing in obviously a pretty divided time and had many people who did not like him, but was overall a pretty popular president. But, there was an entire network dedicated to his, taking him down. So he was operating in a pretty fractured news environment. And yet, when you think about the speeches that now we look back on and sort of were universally lauded, like Selma, I think what he did really well there was, again, kind of tell the story of who we are, really honestly, who we've been and who we could be. And there was sort of a honest reckoning of all that has passed, and yet kind of a hopeful sort of note. And I know that there are those who sort of mock President Obama's message of hope, but I think that's really what people wanted. And in a way, that's actually what Trump was sort of offering a sliver of the country, right? A kind of hope of that America could be whatever they imagined it was once, and making a promise about that. But I think that if you can help your speaker sort of tell a universal truth in a really honest way, that you actually can break through. Mrs. Obama did this beautifully, pretty consistently. She would always, as my friend Sarah Hurwitz, who's her speechwriter, would say, say something true. And I think by doing that and by again, sort of being that really authentic speaker, she actually was able to break through to audiences who may not have necessarily always given her a chance, and to speak to the entire country as First Lady. So I think that there are opportunities to do that. It's just harder.
The fragmentation isn't just the media and news sources. We've had for about 2 generations now a politics, it started on the left, but now you see it on the right, of fragmentation, of identity politics, of going after this group and that group and dividing and then building up little coalitions, but not common ground. Politics of color, politics of gender, politics of region, et cetera, of age bracket. And what has finally happened is that after all the other minorities were identified, what is no longer a majority, but the sort of average white American, has become the biggest minority group. And they've begun to respond to the same messages that all of the grievanced minorities used to respond to. Identity politics. And it is a logical, if not necessarily fortunate progression, but it's part and parcel of something that some of the same people who are decrying it now set into motion.
I guess I would say that this, just to return to a point that you made earlier, from the perspective of history, there are some aspects of this that are not at all new, and the idea of appealing to the grievances of white people is not a new strategy in international politics. It was important to the victory of Richard Nixon in 1968, the so-called Southern strategy, going and speaking in the Code of States' Rights and so forth, appealing to the same whites who had grown disaffected with the Democratic Party's embrace of African Americans and civil rights and so forth. And the same voters that Wallace in 1968 had stoked and stirred up, who emerged from rallies of George Wallace chanting white power, were appealed to in a more sort of deft and subtle and ultimately political effective way. It's the same signal that Ronald Reagan, with all due respect, sent to that group in going and making a campaign appearance in 1980, I believe, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and understanding the signal that it sent to speak to that community in the language of states' rights. So I don't think that even as the demographics in the nation have shifted, that the resentments of white people in the South and other parts of the country who have hated elites and intellectuals for a long time, who have hated the coasts for a long time, that these are new phenomena. So in that sense, what we're seeing from this president is not new. But I think that what you saw with President Nixon, what you saw with President Reagan, is that on assuming the presidency, there was an understanding that, as Sarah said, that they had been elected to be, they hadn't been elected by all the people, but they were in fact president of all the people, and that the role of the president was to be, to the extent that any one of these men in a divided country can, to be president of all the people. We have not seen as consistently a divisive and openly a divisive performance in the Oval Office as we're seeing right now. And that, I think, is what is new about this very old appeal.
Jeff, if I may say, with all due respect, if this were the Nixon period and you were reading the press, you wouldn't have that kind of interpretation about what Richard Nixon was doing. But what I would also say is that the cast you've put on those attitudes is the very reason the Democratic Party has been in decline, because it shows a contempt. It is the wrong interpretation for what wide swaths of people who voted for Trump and voted for all the people you mentioned had in their minds. I see some shaking of the head in the audience, but I will say that these people are responding to real problems in their lives, and they are not related to gender, they are not related to ethnicity, they are related to an economy that is stagnating, that because of the heavy load of regulation and taxes, it's a place in the world that has been slipping because of passivity in the administration of the previous administration. There are a lot of real problems that they've been responding to, and turning up your nose at them and casting them as you just did is not a way to talk to them.
Let me just be clear. They will not come. I would agree with that. We learned that last year. Let me just be clear, Clark.
But it's okay to call women pigs.
Let me be clear where my contempt is directed. Bill Clinton would not have been elected twice, would not have won back a number of the southern states that had been considered to be permanently lost to the Democratic Party, would not have won back a good measure of who were called Reagan Democrats if we collectively had turned up our nose at the economic concerns of working class white Americans in any region of the country. So these are speeches that I know how to write because these are policies that were directed to benefit people who have been economically distressed, with some success and with a lot of failure by every administration represented here. Where my contempt is directed is not at the aspirations of people of any color or any region of this country who are economically distressed. My contempt is saved for openly racist appeals, for scapegoating of those concerns and the pointing of those concerns at elites, at intellectuals, at black people, at immigrants, at Muslims, at any other group. I think that's a disservice to the people that we're all trying to help. So, I'm not going to get painted into MSNBC's corner on this. I think it is a mythology of the Republican Party that there is a contempt on any side for these voters who are so central to their identity.
Very quickly, then let's go back to the audience.
Let me just say this. You are right about President Clinton, and he is alone among recent Democratic Party presidents. The messages that came through loud and clear this last time were in the word deplorable, but in a lot of other ways, were exactly the kind of messages, whatever was intended, that I just described. And you can turn up your nose at them, but that's not the way to talk to people.
I just want to say that, obviously I agree with Jeff, but I think, again, Secretary Clinton's comment was taken out of context. I disagree with her having said that. She was directing it at exactly the kind of people Jeff just talked about, not the entire, electorate that voted for Trump. But again, he was not held to the same standard. And so he could say deplorable things about any number of people, and he was given a pass. And I think the other point I wanted to make really quickly is that we're going to have a really difficult time coming to any kind of politics that means something to people, that unifies people, that advances a policy agenda, if we continue to talk about bringing up the concerns, the legitimate policy concerns of women, minorities, and call them identity politics. As long as we do that, we're really not going to get out of this.
I am an expert on
very quickly, Bob.
Politics.
I want to get back to the.
I grew up in the Deep South in the 1950s, and identity politics was live and well, and it enshrined a system of racial segregation and racial superiority of white people that was every bit as cruel and oppressive as South African apartheid. That lesson has stayed with me. That was identity politics.
All right, up here, one more last question.
I'm in heaven here. I'm political junkie, historian, communications advisor, Canadian.
Your other viewer, Mary Kate.
Yeah, right.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And I actually had just a quick question and a comment. A comment for me, I'm surprised when you mentioned optimists, you didn't mention Trump speechwriters being optimists, because I think the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a new result. They keep giving the speeches, clearly, doesn't read them. There's my plug. But I'm wondering, has Trump irreparably damaged communications? Because from my perspective, which is only me, I think he has. He's taken us, with all due respect, historically, he has taken us to a place we've never gone before. I don't see that we've ever had this mudslinging, this name-calling, this out-and-out bullying. I don't see that having been done anywhere before. Now, granted, we didn't have social media, we didn't have the open access that we have now, and things were not preserved for posterity forever and ever and ever, amen, before. They certainly are now. Has he damaged it forever? Like, is it all downhill from here?
An uplifting closing question.
Right.
Nothing's forever.
And on that happy note.
FDR awarded Iron Crosses to people who were critical of his foreign policy. That, in effect, was saying that you were a Nazi stooge. This name-calling is not new to American politics. The things that were said about Thomas Jefferson, unfortunately many of them true, were disgusting in a way that nothing we've read today in discourse. What it is happening, though, is the political discourse is getting more and more like the social discourse and what you see on television in sitcoms. And, when Abraham Lincoln wrote a speech, he could appeal to people of every education level and draw on the beauty of language from documents like the King James Bible. The language, I'm not talking about theology here. Today, to sort of hit the universal language, you would have to write in a tone that was half Seinfeld and half Homer Simpson, yes. He is deplorable. But anyway, there's been a debasing of the popular culture, which is being reflected. Politics has been a lagging indicator of what's been happening all around us. And you can see it in social stats, behavioral and down the line. And this is not a political issue on one party or the other. It is something that is happening to America. It is a more fragmented, disoriented, a period of questions of what true values are there, what traditional values are there, where do we go from here. But it's not the first time this has happened in history, and in the long term, we're all footnotes.
Can I end on
Please.
a little lighter, more positive note? So I'm involved with the Miller Center down at UVA, and the Miller Center launched the First Year Project to advise whoever won the election. This was founded when we had 17 people running on each side, basically. And so I was tasked with researching the changing nature of political communications. And so I thought I would share with you that the 2016 election cycle really did break new ground in terms of the number of people who got their political news from YouTube, which is shocking to me. I feel like you're like, how do you watch political news on YouTube? What is Snapchat? It was all new to me. I learned all about it. And the number of people who now regularly listen to podcasts equals the number of people on Twitter. So what those two things tell me is that despite all of the cultural debasement, the name-calling, all the craziness that we're seeing, that says to me that there is a hunger out there on the part of voters for content, that they are educating themselves. They are not just sticking their heads in the sand and saying, you people are all crazy. There's a tremendous yearning that I've seen. I made a documentary about President Bush. I take it around the country to young people. Tremendous hunger for stories about American greatness, about bipartisanship, about what can we learn from the current situation. And I think there's great hope for us coming through this period with a better educated citizenry. I think there's a real feeling in a lot of people's minds that we need civics education in our schools again. And I think there's great hope. And so if I could end on that note, and not about the divisions that we hear about so much every day, and think about where do we go from here and how do we improve our situation here in this country.
And I would just... I would just add to it that I think this panel, which had a lot of very strongly held and strongly expressed disagreement, but I think very respectfully expressed, also gives us that hope. So I'd like to thank them. And I'd like to thank all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
With a busy week ahead for Congress, we'll have live coverage of two significant